October 27th, 1944. Hill 617. Vosges Mountains, eastern France. The rain had not stopped for 3 days. In the dense pine forests of the Vosges, visibility dropped to less than 10 feet. The temperature hovered just above freezing, turning the mountain paths into rivers of mud. Somewhere in this hellscape, 275 men of the 1st Battalion, 141st Infantry Regiment, the Alamo Regiment from Texas, huddled in shallow foxholes surrounded by German forces running out of ammunition, food and hope. They had been trapped for 3 days, victims of a command decision that would become one of the most controversial in American military history. Now, as German artillery methodically reduced their perimeter, their only hope lay with an unlikely rescue force: Japanese-American soldiers whose own families remained imprisoned in American concentration camps. What followed over the next 6 days would become the stuff of legend, a rescue mission so costly that the rescuers suffered more casualties than the number of men they saved. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team would lose more than 800 men to save 211 trapped Texans. In doing so, they would shatter German military assumptions about American fighting capability and force America itself to confront its own prejudices. This is the story of the Lost Battalion Rescue, one of the 10 most significant ground battles in US Army history, according to military historians. It is a story of impossible courage, questionable command decisions, and the price of proving loyalty in blood. The crisis began on October 24, 1944, with a decision that violated basic military principles. Major General John Ernest Dahlquist, commanding the 36th Infantry Division, ordered the 1st Battalion, 141st Infantry Regiment, to advance beyond friendly lines into the densely forested Vosges Mountains. The objective: seize high ground near Biffontaine and cut German supply routes. Lieutenant Martin Higgins, the battalion's operations officer, immediately recognized the danger. The unit would be advancing without flank protection, without reserves, and without a secure supply line. The narrow logging road that served as their only connection to friendly forces could be easily cut by German forces. But Dahlquist, from his headquarters miles behind the lines, insisted on aggressive action. By noon on October 24th, the battalion had advanced approximately 4 miles and reached their objective, a narrow ridge designated Hill 205. They established defensive positions among the pine trees and waited for the rest of the regiment to link up with them. That link-up never came. The German 19th Army, under General Friedrich Wiese, had been waiting for exactly this opportunity. Wehrmacht forces had deliberately withdrawn from certain positions, allowing the Americans to advance into what military strategists call a planned encirclement. Once the battalion was in position, German forces struck from 3 directions simultaneously. Elements of the German 201st Mountain Battalion seized the high ground overlooking the American position. The 933rd Grenadier Regiment cut the supply road behind them. Additional German units sealed the remaining gaps. Within hours, the 1st Battalion was completely surrounded by an estimated 6,000 to 8,000 German troops. The German forces had spent weeks preparing defensive positions in the Vosges. They had constructed reinforced bunkers, laid thousands of mines, including wooden shoe mines invisible to metal detectors, and positioned artillery on reverse slopes where American counter-battery fire couldn't reach them. Most devastating was their use of tree-burst artillery, shells fused to explode in the forest canopy, creating lethal showers of metal fragments and wood splinters that made foxholes nearly useless. Within 24 hours of encirclement, the trapped battalion's situation became critical. German forces launched probing attacks from multiple directions while maintaining constant mortar and artillery harassment. The Americans, who had expected a brief advance, carried only basic combat loads of ammunition and 3 days of rations. Water became the most critical shortage. The only source was a stream 60 yards outside the perimeter, completely exposed to German machine gun positions. Men crawled out at night, pressing themselves into the mud as tracers passed overhead, trying to fill canteens and helmets. Many didn't make it back. Attempts to resupply by air failed repeatedly. P-47 Thunderbolts from the 365th Fighter Group dropped supplies by parachute, but in the dense forest and fog most packages fell into German hands or were lost in the wilderness. Of numerous supply drops attempted, the trapped battalion recovered only a handful. On October 26th, other elements of the 141st Infantry attempted the first rescue. They advanced less than 800 yards before German defences stopped them cold. The 142nd Infantry Regiment tried next, attempting to flank German positions through a neighbouring valley. They walked into a minefield covered by pre-registered artillery and were forced to withdraw after suffering heavy casualties. Radio operator Erwin Blonder maintained intermittent contact with division headquarters using the battalion's last functioning SCR-300 radio. Limited battery power meant they could only transmit twice daily. The messages grew increasingly desperate as the days passed, requesting medical supplies, ammunition, and immediate relief. On October 27th, as conventional rescue attempts continued to fail, General Dahlquist made the decision that would define his controversial legacy. He ordered the 442nd Regimental Combat Team to break through to the lost battalion. His exact words, recorded by his aide, were, "Get them out at any cost." The 442nd had just been pulled off the line after 9 days of continuous combat liberating the towns of Bruyères and Biffontaine. They had suffered significant casualties and had been in reserve for only 36 hours, not enough time to integrate replacements, repair equipment, or rest. Many soldiers still wore summer uniforms in the freezing mountain conditions. The 442nd was unique in the American military, a segregated unit composed entirely of Japanese-American soldiers, or Nisei, second-generation Japanese-Americans. While they fought in Europe, approximately 120,000 Japanese Americans, including many of their families, remained imprisoned in camps across the American West, detained without trial under Executive Order 9066. The unit's motto was, "Go for broke," Hawaiian pidgin slang meaning to risk everything on one supreme effort. They had already distinguished themselves in Italy, earning more decorations in 6 months than most units earned in years. Lieutenant Colonel Virgil Miller, commanding the 100th Infantry Battalion, attached to the 442nd, protested the order directly to Dahlquist. His men desperately needed rest and winter equipment. Dahlquist's response was blunt. American soldiers were dying, and the 442nd would rescue them. At 0400 hours on October 28th, the 442nd began their advance. The plan called for the 100th Battalion to attack on the right flank, the 2nd Battalion on the left, with the 3rd Battalion in reserve. The 522nd Field Artillery Battalion would provide support, though the forest and weather made accurate fire nearly impossible. The conditions were hellish. Rain had turned every path into mud. The Germans had spent weeks preparing interlocking fields of fire, mining approaches, and registering artillery on every possible avenue of advance. The first contact came just after dawn. Lead elements of Company E walked into an ambush. German MG-42 machine guns opened fire from concealed positions at point-blank range. Within seconds, multiple soldiers were down. The 442nd's response was immediate and violent. Rather than seeking cover and calling for artillery, they fixed bayonets and charged directly into the German positions. This tactic, frontal assault against fortified positions, violated American military doctrine, which emphasized firepower over maneuver. But the Nisei soldiers had learned that aggressive close combat could overcome defensive advantages. German soldiers, trained to expect American forces to withdraw when faced with heavy casualties, were psychologically unprepared for enemies who kept advancing despite mounting losses. Company K, advancing on the opposite flank, hit a minefield. The first mine took a soldier's foot off at the ankle. As medics rushed forward, more mines detonated. The company was forced to halt while engineers crawled forward on their bellies, probing for mines with bayonets. By the end of the first day, the 442nd had advanced less than a mile at tremendous cost. But they had achieved something important. They had identified the main German defensive line along a series of ridges that blocked access to the lost battalion. October 29th and 30th would see some of the most intense combat of World War II. The key terrain feature was Hill 617, a steep ridge that dominated all approaches to the lost battalion. The Germans had turned it into a fortress with 3 separate trench lines, reinforced concrete bunkers, and pre-registered artillery support. The assault began at dawn with a massive artillery barrage from the 522nd Field Artillery Battalion. Over 4,000 rounds fell on German positions in 3 hours, but the bunkers, built into the reverse slope, survived largely intact. When the 442nd Infantry advanced, they met withering fire. What happened next has become legendary in military history. Individual soldiers, seeing their attacks stalling, performed acts of extraordinary heroism. Private Barney Hajiro, a recent replacement from Hawaii, stood up in full view of German positions and walked forward through machine gun fire. He single-handedly destroyed 2 machine gun nests and killed 2 snipers, even after being wounded in the shoulder. His actions inspired his entire company to rise and charge. On another part of the battlefield, Private George Joe Sakato led a charge that turned impending defeat into victory. When his platoon was pinned down and in danger of being overrun, Sakato single-handedly charged a German position defended by 12 soldiers. He killed 12 enemy soldiers, wounded 2, and captured 4, allowing his unit to advance. These individual acts of courage enabled the 442nd to break through German lines. But the cost was staggering. Company K, which had started with 186 men, was reduced to 17 riflemen still able to fight. Company I fared even worse, with only 8 of 185 men remaining unhurt. Technical Sergeant Takeo Senzaki was among the first to reach the lost battalion at approximately 1600 hours on October 30th. His first recorded words to the trapped Texans were, "Need any cigarettes?" The link-up had been achieved, but the battle was far from over. Reaching the lost battalion was only half the mission. They still had to be evacuated through 2 miles of enemy-held territory. The Germans immediately launched counterattacks to close the gap, resulting in fierce fighting throughout the night of October 30th. The evacuation began with the wounded. Nisei soldiers carried stretchers through mine-infested forests, while German snipers and artillery continued to take their toll. Each trip took hours, with bearers having to stop frequently to rest or take cover from enemy fire. The walking wounded and able-bodied soldiers of the lost battalion were evacuated over the next 2 days. Throughout this period, the 442nd had to hold open the corridor against repeated German attempts to cut it. The fighting was often hand-to-hand, with soldiers using knives, entrenching tools and rifle butts when ammunition ran low. By November 1st, all 211 surviving members of the lost battalion had been evacuated. The 1st Battalion, 141st Infantry, had lost 64 men during their encirclement, but the 442nd had paid a far higher price, more than 800 casualties in 6 days of fighting. On November 12, 1944, General Dahlquist ordered the 442nd to assemble for a recognition ceremony. He expected to see the full regiment, approximately 3,000 men. Instead, fewer than 900 soldiers stood in formation. According to multiple witness accounts, Dahlquist asked Lieutenant Colonel Virgil Miller where the rest of the regiment was. Miller's response became legendary among veterans. "General, this is the regiment. The rest are either dead or in the hospital." The devastating casualties raised immediate questions about Dahlquist's leadership. Why had he sent the 1st Battalion into such an exposed position? Why had he chosen the understrength 442nd for the rescue when other, larger units were available? Many veterans and historians have concluded that Dahlquist viewed the Japanese-American soldiers as more expendable than white units. The controversy deepened when, despite the regiment's devastating casualties, Dahlquist ordered them to continue offensive operations for 9 more days before finally allowing them to rest. Years later, when Dahlquist approached Lieutenant Colonel Gordon Singles at Fort Bragg, saying, "Let bygones be bygones," Singles reportedly refused to shake his hand in front of assembled officers. The heroism displayed during the Lost Battalion rescue should have resulted in numerous medals of honor. Initially, however, not a single soldier received America's highest decoration for this action. Distinguished Service Crosses were awarded to soldiers whose actions clearly met Medal of Honor criteria, a pattern of discrimination that affected Asian American soldiers throughout the war. It would take more than 50 years for justice to be done. In the 1990s, Congress ordered a review of Distinguished Service Cross awards to Asian American World War II veterans. The review board found systematic discrimination in medal awards. On June 21, 2000, President Bill Clinton presented the Medal of Honor to 22 Asian American veterans of World War II, including Barney Hajiro and George Sakato, posthumously, for their actions during the Lost Battalion rescue. In his remarks, Clinton acknowledged the injustice. Rarely has a nation been so well served by a people it has so ill-treated. The statistics of the Lost Battalion rescue tell a stark story. Men rescued: 211 surviving members of the 1st Battalion, 141st Infantry. 442nd casualties, more than 800 killed, wounded and missing. Casualty ratio, nearly 4-to-1. Days of combat, 6 days to reach the battalion, 9 more days of continued operations. But numbers cannot capture the human dimension. These were American soldiers whose families were imprisoned by their own government, who volunteered to fight for a country that questioned their loyalty, who suffered casualties that would have broken most units, all to prove they were American enough. The psychological impact on survivors was severe. Many suffered from what we now recognize as PTSD, though mental health support for veterans was minimal at the time. The Japanese cultural concept of gaman, enduring the unbearable with patience and dignity, meant most suffered in silence. German military records and post-war accounts reveal that Wehrmacht forces were unprepared for the intensity of the 442nd assault. The Japanese-American soldiers violated German tactical expectations. They attacked fortified positions frontally, accepted casualties that should have stopped any advance, and continued fighting even when wounded. General Friedrich Wieser's after-action reports noted that the 442nd displayed a disregard for casualties unprecedented in our experience fighting American forces. German soldiers reported that wounded Nisei soldiers continued fighting, that units maintained cohesion despite losses exceeding 75%, and that the intensity of close combat exceeded anything they had experienced. The defeat in the Vosges forced German military leadership to reassess their assumptions about American military capabilities and the role of racial minorities in the US Army. The supposedly inferior Japanese-American soldiers had broken through positions the Wehrmacht considered impregnable. The relationship between the rescued Texans and their Nisei rescuers became one of the most enduring legacies of the battle. Many of the Texans had grown up in the segregated South and had never met a Japanese-American before. The shared ordeal transformed initial suspicion into lifelong brotherhood. In 1962, Texas Governor John Connally proclaimed all members of the 442nd to be honorary Texans in recognition of their sacrifice. Veterans of both units maintained contact for decades, attending each other's reunions, weddings, and funerals. When anti-Japanese sentiment flared during economic downturns in later decades, Lost Battalion veterans were among the first to speak out in defense of Japanese Americans. They understood, perhaps better than anyone, the price the Nisei had paid to prove their loyalty. The Lost Battalion rescue had implications far beyond its military importance. The extraordinary sacrifice of the 442nd made it impossible to justify continued discrimination against Japanese Americans. How could America maintain that these were disloyal citizens when they had suffered such casualties rescuing white soldiers? The 442nd became the most decorated unit for its size and length of service in U.S. military history, earning 21 Medals of Honor, most awarded decades later. 29 Distinguished Service Crosses, 588 Silver Stars, 5,200 Bronze Stars, over 4,000 Purple Hearts, 8 Presidential Unit citations. Their service helped pave the way for redress for Japanese-American internment. In 1988, President Ronald Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act, formally apologizing for internment and providing compensation to survivors. Many 442nd veterans were instrumental in achieving this recognition. Military historians continue to debate whether the Lost Battalion rescue was necessary and whether the use of the 442nd constituted discrimination. The evidence suggests complex motivations and systemic prejudice. General Dahlquist consistently assigned the 442nd to the most dangerous missions. He ignored requests for rest and reinforcement. Most tellingly, he had other units available, larger, fresher units, that could have attempted the rescue. The tactical decision to send the understrength 442nd rather than fresh units from the 36th Division remains controversial. Some historians argue the 442nd was chosen because they were the best unit available. Others contend they were selected because Japanese-American casualties would be more politically acceptable than losses in white units. What is undeniable is that the 442nd could not refuse the mission without seeming to confirm suspicions about their loyalty. They were trapped by prejudice as surely as the Lost Battalion was trapped by Germans. The Lost Battalion rescue offers profound lessons about citizenship, loyalty, and the cost of prejudice. It demonstrates that questioning citizens' loyalty based on ancestry weakens military effectiveness and violates American principles. It shows how marginalized groups often must pay the highest price to prove their belonging. Most importantly, it proves that American identity is not determined by ancestry, but by sacrifice and service. The Nisei soldiers defined patriotism not as blind allegiance, but as fighting for American ideals, even when America fell short of those ideals. The rescue also demonstrated the strength that diversity brings to military forces. The 442nd's cohesion, born from shared marginalization, made them more effective than conventional units. Their determination to prove themselves drove them to extraordinary achievement. As the decades passed, the number of survivors dwindled. Veterans of both the 442nd and the Lost Battalion carried physical and psychological scars from the Vosges. But they also carried an unbreakable bond forged in those terrible days. Lost Battalion veteran Martin Higgins, who had sent desperate radio messages during the encirclement, maintained lifelong friendships with his rescuers. Before his death, he said, "Those boys saved our lives while their families were locked up back home. That's not just courage. That's a kind of heroism I still can't fully understand." Nisei veteran Sus Ito reflected, "We went up that mountain to save American soldiers. Not white soldiers or Texas soldiers, American soldiers. That's what we were too, despite everything. American soldiers." Today, the rescue of the Lost Battalion is studied in military academies as an example of small unit tactics and extraordinary determination. At West Point, a plaque honouring the 442nd reads, "These soldiers proved that uncommon valour was a common virtue." But the greater legacy is social and moral. The sacrifice of the 442nd helped transform American understanding of citizenship and belonging. Their service made it impossible to maintain that loyalty could be determined by race or ancestry. Veterans of the 442nd used their moral authority to fight for civil rights after the war. Daniel Inauye, who lost his right arm fighting in Italy with the 442nd, became Hawaii's first congressman and served in the Senate for nearly 50 years. Spark Matsunaga, another 442nd veteran, joined him in the Senate. Together, they were instrumental in achieving redress for internment. The Lost Battalion rescue ultimately reveals the terrible cost of prejudice, not just to its victims, but to the nation that harbours it. The 442nd's excessive casualties were partly due to their need to prove loyalty through extraordinary sacrifice. America lost many of its best citizens because prejudice demanded they pay a higher price than others. The battle also exposed flaws in military leadership when influenced by racial bias. Dahlquist's apparent willingness to expend Japanese-American lives more freely than white lives resulted in unnecessary casualties and remains a stain on his military record. Yet from this injustice emerged something remarkable, proof that American ideals are stronger than American prejudices. The Nisei soldiers fought not for a perfect America, but for the America that could be, should be, and sometimes manages to become. October 30th, 1944, 1600 hours. Technical Sergeant Takeo Senzaki of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team emerges from the forest and makes contact with the Lost Battalion. After 6 days of the bloodiest fighting in the European theatre, after more than 800 casualties, the link-up is achieved. The exhausted Texans can barely believe their rescuers are Japanese-American. Some had never met an Asian-American before. Yet here they are, having paid an almost unimaginable price to save fellow Americans. This moment, when prejudice met sacrifice, when assumption met reality, when Americans saved Americans regardless of race, encapsulates both the tragedy and triumph of the Lost Battalion rescue. It represents America at its worst, sending citizens to die to prove loyalty while imprisoning their families. But it also represents America at its best, when courage transcends prejudice and shared sacrifice creates unbreakable bonds. In 2000, the Go for Broke Monument was dedicated in Los Angeles, honouring all Japanese-American soldiers of World War II. The monument lists over 16,000 names of those who served, including more than 700 who died in service. At the dedication, Secretary of Veterans Affairs Herschel Gober said, "These soldiers fought 2 wars, one against fascism abroad, one against prejudice at home. They won both, though at a cost that should humble us all." The monument bears the 442nd's motto, "Go for broke." But perhaps the most fitting tribute comes from the Lost Battalion veterans themselves, who insisted their rescuers' names be included on their own memorials. As one Texas veteran put it, "They're our brothers. They earned that with blood." The rescue of the Lost Battalion transcends military history to become a defining moment in American identity. It proved that heroism has no colour, that loyalty cannot be predicted by ancestry, and that the most profound patriotism often comes from those who have the most reason to question their country. The German officers who dismissed the Nisei as inferior fighters learned that courage transcends race. The American generals who saw them as expendable learned that every citizen's life has equal value. The Texas soldiers who had never met a Japanese American learned that brotherhood is forged in sacrifice, not blood. Most importantly, America learned that its greatest defenders might come from its most marginalized communities, that strength lies in diversity, and that the true test of citizenship is not whether you fight for a perfect country, but whether you fight to make your country more perfect. Military historians continue to study the Lost Battalion rescue as one of the most extraordinary episodes in American military history. The tactical achievement, breaking through prepared German positions despite overwhelming disadvantage, remains impressive. But the moral significance overshadows the military accomplishment. The rescue demonstrated that American ideals, equality, justice, liberty, could triumph over American prejudices. It proved that what makes America exceptional is not perfection, but the capacity for redemption through sacrifice. From a purely military perspective, The operation was costly. More than 800 casualties to save 211 men violates every principle of military economy. But history judges by different metrics than military manuals. Some victories are worth any price. Some stands must be taken regardless of cost. Some principles must be defended even unto death. The 442nd understood this. They went up that mountain not just to save the lost battalion, but to save America's claim to moral leadership. They fought not just against German forces, but against the prejudice that questioned their place in America. They bled not just for military victory, but for the principle that all Americans are created equal. The story of the Lost Battalion rescue is ultimately about the complexity of American identity and the redemptive power of sacrifice. It reminds us that citizenship is earned not through birthright, but through service, that prejudice weakens the nation it claims to protect, and that America's strength lies not in uniformity, but in the determination of diverse peoples to forge a common destiny. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team went for broke in the Vosges Mountains. They gave everything, held nothing back. In doing so, they didn't just save 211 trapped soldiers, they helped save America's soul, proving that even in its darkest moments of prejudice and fear, the nation could produce citizens of such extraordinary courage that enemy and ally alike would stand in awe. The forest has reclaimed Hill 617. The foxholes have filled with fallen leaves, the bunkers have crumbled, but the memory endures, of young men who climbed an impossible mountain, who bled for those who scorned them, who died for a country that had not yet learned to love them back. They were the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. They were Japanese Americans, they were patriots, they were heroes, and they were, above all else, Americans. Their sacrifice echoes across the decades, reminding each generation that freedom is not free, that citizenship demands service, and that the highest form of patriotism is fighting to make your country worthy of its ideals. In the dark forests of the Vosges, a group of marginalized Americans proved that loyalty cannot be questioned when it is written in blood, that courage knows no color, and that the true strength of America lies in the willingness of all its people, regardless of origin, to stand together in democracy's defense. The lost battalion was saved, but more importantly, an ideal was preserved, that in America, citizenship is not about where you come from, but what you're willing to sacrifice for the principles of human dignity and equality. The 442nd proved this truth in the most emphatic way possible. They earned their place in America not through words, but through deeds, not through birthright, but through sacrifice, not through acceptance, but through undeniable courage. This is their legacy, that from the darkest prejudice can emerge the brightest heroism, that those deemed least loyal may prove most faithful, and that America's greatest strength lies not in the uniformity of its people, but in their shared commitment to defend ideals larger than any individual, any group, any prejudice. The rescue of the lost battalion remains one of the most extraordinary episodes in American military history, not just for what was accomplished, but for who accomplished it and what it meant. In those 6 days in October 1944, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team didn't just save a battalion. They helped save the idea of America itself.